October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Domestic violence happens to all education and income levels. It happens in all races and religions. It happens to women and even men. It has negative impacts to the development of children, and there's a stigma around domestic violence. After this conversation, I hope you'll be able to talk with your family, friends, coworkers about this issue. And if you're a victim of abuse, I hope you'll feel empowered to ask for help. We're joined today by two amazing people. They're friends of mine, Scott Lancaster and Lenzi Dodgen. Scott has worked in children's advocacy for years, and he is a program manager for Greenhouse 17 in Lexington. And Lenzi has worked with foster kids and been an advocate for sexual and gender-based violence victims. And we are honored to have you guys here. So welcome to Conversations That Matter.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So we're here to talk about a really important issue that you guys commit your entire professional lives to, and that's around domestic violence or intimate partner violence. Tell us what domestic violence is.
So I think that if you were to ask folks, what is your understanding of domestic violence? And I think depending on how many people you asked, you'd probably get that many different definitions.
Right. Because
there seems to be a lot of folks that maybe can't quite define it, or certain groups have decided this is the way that we are going to define it. And that's okay too. I think maybe for the purposes of this conversation, I think that it could probably be defined with, I think that it probably needs to include elements of power and control in a romantic relationship. If you're thinking about the dyad of two people, there needs to be a pattern of behavior that is coercive and controlling.
Yeah, is it ever really about the abuse?
Well, I think what you're talking about is the physical assault piece. And yes, people can use.
But it goes much deeper than that. The ideology is around much more than that.
It really does. And there's a whole lot more ways and behaviors, coercive, pervasive behaviors that happen within a romantic partnership, where these things occur and they're present, and that is how we're defining domestic violence. It's not just physical assault. You know, if it were just about the hitting, then our definition and our problem would be different. Although hitting is a very common vision that people have in their heads when you say the word domestic violence. People automatically think of the wife that's being battered. And the reality is that it's not just one component. It's not just physical assault. It is, it's a myriad of behaviors. And recently, there's some research and some scholars that really started to define this as intimate terrorism. And that really resonates with me, given some of the things that I have seen within my practice.
Because it is.
Because ultimately, yes, when you think about terrorism and what that is, the definition,
you're always on guard.
You really start to that resonates, especially with survivors who have survived and experienced domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And we have a lot of terms, right? Domestic violence, intimate partner violence, interpersonal violence. There's a lot of different ways to say it. Family violence, sexual and gender-based violence. So I think that there's a lot of different terms, and they all intersect at some point with the topic of conversation that we're actually having today. Yeah. And it sort of depends on who you're trying to include, and if you're trying to be more narrow and speak more specifically about a certain type of violence. Interpersonal violence would be a dyad of two people. Domestic violence might actually be a family unit, or you might be thinking of something more inclusive and a little bit broader.
And the components of that really is the same across the board.
Sure.
No matter what situation or
that's rooted in power and control.
Who is involved? It is, yeah. Well, let's talk some about the prevalence of domestic violence, specifically in America. And I know there's so many components to domestic violence, and you've touched on some of those now, but in my research, this is not my lane. This is why I have Scott and Lenzi here to talk about this important issue. I learned that nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. That's astounding. I knew it was an issue because I know you guys and I'm friends with you. I see the work that you do, and it's everywhere. But I was flabbergasted by the numbers. 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 men have been victims of some form of physical violence by an intimate partner within their lifetime. Let's talk about how we get there. How does it happen? How is it so prevalent? I mean, I know it's a semester course long, but
Sure.
you know, how is this such an epidemic in our society?
Sure.
It's one of those things that's always been there.
Yeah.
Right. There's always kind of been this, and you know, just for the sake of this conversation, you know, we'll say men and women, right? Just to kind of make this as brief as possible. There's always been, or at least seemingly, there's always been power imbalance between the genders. Okay, and so that's how those kind of things are set up. So in any kind of social power dynamic that you have, you know, the people who are in power are trying to maintain that kind of power. So structures are put in place to sort of allow that to happen. You know, and we still, in a lot of ways, still support some of those structures today. I mean, you look at something as celebrated as, say, you know, your bog standard wedding, right? You know, a lot of the imagery, a lot of the traditions that are that continue to be followed in that are, you know, rooted in the exchange of property from one man to another, that property being a woman. And so, you know, these kind of things have kind of always been there, and you know, it's really hard to it's really hard to dismantle that power structure, especially when it's, you know, it's
And
rooted
that
in so
culture
much
really
history.
embedded in our
Yeah,
society.
and you know, and we talk about culture. This is a human culture.
Yeah.
This is not an American culture.
Right.
This is not a Latino culture or anything like that. This is a human culture. You know, you see these numbers, and they're fairly similar from continent to continent. You know, and people like to talk about cultural issues that might lead to, say, some domestic violence, and you know, at the end of the day, that's just the reasoning they use.
Mm-hmm.
But we're doing it too. Our cultural norms are different, but ultimately we're all getting into
that
that
leads to
state.
the same
Right.
thing.
1 in 3 women over the course of their lifetime will be a victim of domestic violence, and so, you know, the prevalence is there because this is how we have chosen to live. We've chosen to live in a society that, you know, stratifies people based on whatever. You know, it could be race, it could be income, it could be, in this case, gender. And you know, that gender dynamic that was set up also set the stage for what a relationship is supposed to look like. And so that's why you see a lot of the same kind of dynamics in same-sex couples or intersex couples. You know, so because the idea of what a relationship looks like, you know, that you have somebody that's supposed to be in power for whatever reason. You know, those kind of things, they get perpetuated in how we see relationships. Because ultimately, I think the big problem, or one of the big problems with domestic violence, then it gets back into that definition. We need to have a definition that we all kind of agree on, you know, and one of the issues that I have with just the term is the use of the word violence, you know, because, you know, we hear violence and, you know, just historically, we've got this idea of what that is and what that looks like. And so that's what keeps us stuck on, oh, well, the domestic violence relationship is one where a man is beating up a woman occasionally to get his way or for whatever reason.
And where it also builds that stigma around it too, which we'll get more into later.
Of course. And so, you know, we have to agree on a definition of what that looks like. We have to get away from the notion of, you know, domestic violence is what we see over here down the street with this couple that is always yelling at each other. I mean, there's a lot of ways to control people that have nothing to do with physical violence. They don't even have anything to do with calling names or anything like that. There's financial control, sexual control, all types of different control that people will put on their partners. And you know, if we can get everybody to kind of come to some sort of consensus on how to define domestic violence, then we can really start working towards some solutions.
Do you think we'd be more aware of our behavior too if it was less stigmatized and we talk more about it in general, whether it be in our family dynamics or friends at the water cooler at work? Do you think if there was more conversation around it, would be more reminded and the perpetrators would be less apt to perpetrate?
So
Or
I'm
is
gonna
it an embedded
No,
type
It's a big
personal
ask.
culture?
Yeah, that's
It's
a
a
lofty
big
ask.
It's a big ask to ask somebody who does have power, right, to say give that up. And I'm not saying it doesn't need to happen. It needs to happen, but that's a big ask. There's a huge level of humility that somebody has to come to in order to make that.
Well, the relationship needs balance, right? And if one
Sure.
is outweighing the
Right.
other,
But see, how are
that
we defining
precipitates
the
that.
relationship and how are we defining the balance? Historically, the man is sort of the shot caller. He's bringing home the money. He's the breadwinner. And there's a lot of social structures that help to reinforce those things. And so, again, we have to dismantle some of those issues. And when you talk to people one-on-one, like, I was raised a Catholic, and, there's certain things about the faith that I was raised in that kind of stipulate that, men are here and women are here. When you talk to somebody one-on-one, 99 out of 100 times, you're going to get the response, oh, well, that's allegorical. It's like, okay, but that's how we're living.
But that's
So-
real life.
So it's hard. Again, it's hard to get people to own that part of it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's hard to get people to look in the mirror and be honest with themselves, and then share that honesty with the folks around them. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's okay. And so let me kind of put a female perspective on the question that you asked, which is, what if we had more conversations? I would like for all of us to think more deeply about the fact that women have always been having these conversations.
Yeah.
We are
Yeah.
always begging for everyone to listen to our experiences and how the world is really kind of how we are processing our experiences in our world, because like we said, there is no institution that is not touched by these types of things. And so I guess my challenge would be for folks to listen to the women in your life, because if you don't think that this is an issue, that means that you're not listening and talking to the women that you know. And so when you say, do you think that we should have more conversations? Yes. But you should join the
We should join the
conversation
conversation.
because women have
Yeah.
been having this conversation.
Yeah, we're
We
just
have
catching
been
up.
begging for you guys to pay attention to our conversation
Right.
that we're having.
Right. And that would lend a lot of vulnerability to men if we would
Indeed.
just jump headfirst into that space and be willing to break it down and look at how we contribute to that
Right.
human culture. Even
So it
Even
means,
when we're not trying.
yeah,
it means, do you
have more of a
want to
consciousness about
do you want to be vulnerable?
Yeah.
Right? Do you want to be an ally? And what does that mean to you? Does that mean that you actually care? And what does define caring? Right? So it means, what is your goal and what are you hoping to achieve with that? Our goal is to bring you guys into our conversation and say, dear men, we have a problem.
Yeah.
We need you to help us move this forward. And we do.
We need you to hear us and then join the conversation.
But we also need
and
you
then
to
change your behavior.
validate. Right.
Yeah.
We need you to validate our experiences,
Yeah.
because just because you haven't had what I've experienced doesn't mean that experience is invalid or it
Right.
didn't happen or it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And this is prevalent and pervasive, what women experience, especially when they come forward with a powerful story of survival, and they say, this happened to me. We're experiencing it right now with the,
Me too.
with the confirmation of
Yeah.
our Supreme Court justice that's happening. There is someone that has come forward and said, this is my story, this happened to me. And the very first question is, why is she just now coming out now? When our question should be, why does he feel like he's entitled to sexually assault her? Right?
And what kind of constraints have we built around her and other women feeling like it's safe to come out?
It's because
Well,
it's really not.
when we constantly
Doesn't seem like it.
deny their story,
Yes.
we continue to make it almost impossible or too fearful for her to speak out.
Well, it's not safe. It's not safe. Physically, it's not safe for folks to come forward sometimes, not always, but it's not physically safe, and it's certainly not emotionally safe, especially in the technological world that we live in right now. People get real brave behind a screen on a keyboard.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you as a person that identifies as a victim or a survivor, and to be clear, you get to identify however you want if you've had this experience. But if you have had this experience, and you're trying to make sense of it and you're trying to process it, you're working on your own healing process. Whether you come forward or don't, it's all hard, and whatever you decide that makes the most sense for you is perfectly acceptable. No one owes anybody their trauma narrative.
Yeah.
No one's entitled to that.
And a more vulnerable demographic, women between the ages of 18 and 24 are most commonly abused by an intimate partner. And that age group is probably one that would be most afraid, I'm guessing, and probably not have as much life experience to know how and when and to whom to reach out to, or think that she did something wrong, or think that someone's not going to believe her. That may apply to all age groups, I'm not sure.
Indeed it does.
But nonetheless,
Indeed it does.
18 to 24 is the most commonly perpetrated group among females.
So there's a couple of things happening, right? 18 to 24, I just want to throw this in here. 18 to 24 is my favorite age group. It's the age group I currently work with this age group, and it's absolutely my favorite one. So a lot of different mixed messages are happening right now with this particular demographic, right? They're coming into their own. There's a lot of development happening. There's an adjustment from childhood into adulthood. Oftentimes there's college or a professional career that's being developed of some kind. And so there's a lot of overarching contributing factors to what's happening to a person during that time, during that age. And so when they've had an experience such as intimate partner violence or sexual assault or both, when they've had that type of experience, there's often a dialogue that happens. What just happened? Did this really happen? Is this really did this really happen to me? Because before this age, the conversation is always othered. In other words, this happens to them over there. This happens to the ones who drink.
Yeah.
This happens to the ones who are poor.
Yeah.
This happens to these and that and the other.
This happens to the ones who weren't smart enough to see it coming.
Yeah.
These are-
And it's so false.
And so you get othered, right? So
Yeah.
you do all the things that you can do to set yourself aside, to put distance between you and the other.
Yeah.
And in reality, what we really actually should be realistically talking about is that this does not happen in a vacuum.
Yeah.
In no way, shape, or form, if we were able to isolate the causation,
We could have fixed it already.
we would be well on our way.
Yeah.
The unfortunate part is that this does not occur in a vacuum. This
Well,
does not.
1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men in the United States will be a victim of rape in their lifetime.
Yes.
So 1 in 5 women. And we're talking about an age group right now of 18 to 24, mostly college age.
Yes.
And if we go into it thinking, young girls thinking, it's the other girl, it's the girl that drinks too much, or the girl that parties too much.
The girl that hangs out with
then-
the frat boys, right? That's
We're believing a false narrative, right?
wholeheartedly
Yeah.
not
Well,
true.
we're setting up the blame.
Yes.
We're
for her.
we're setting the
Yeah.
table to be able
Yeah.
to blame those kind of issues, because those are things that you can look at and be like, oh, well, there's the fix. Stop drinking as much. Oh, your skirt should be a little bit longer, or you shouldn't walk around these parts at night. And all of those kind of things focus on the folks who are being raped. They're not focusing on the rapers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
What she did wrong to get raped.
Yeah, like that shouldn't even be. I mean, whatever. When you're talking about safety,
It's the
you should
general
always take
consensus.
precautions.
It's the
but at
general
the-
conversation.
but
If
at the
really
we
end
just
of
have to
the
be
day-
honest about it.
But at the end of the day, we need to be focused on the people that are perpetrating these crimes. So in the case of, say, rape on a college campus, right, you know, they offer escorts for folks who want to get from a building to another building after dark or whatever. Most college campuses will do something like that. Well,
sure.
That's focusing on the victim. If we focus on the perpetrators, why
Yeah.
don't we say, okay, men can't walk around campus after dark without an escort. We got to make sure you're not going to rape somebody.
And this was a little
It
bit
puts the focus on the perpetrator instead of the victim.
It's a little bit off topic when we're talking about the prevalence of domestic violence, but what are we doing, this part of it is, what are we doing to determine what leads a man to perpetrate? What kind of changes or behaviors are we taking, or are there any, to discover what leads a man to do this to a woman, whether it's college age or 45 years old? Again, like you said, we're always trying to find ways for the female to have to change. But what are we doing around the perpetrator other than not nearly enough incarcerating them?
Well, that's not always the answer either.
Yeah.
It's not the
Right.
answer, because the cycle just continues, right? And the occurrences of this, as we see from statistics, that it's as prevalent now as ever.
Well, when you're
So-
talking about things like entitlement, you know, if you send somebody to jail, then they've just been robbed of their entitlement. Feel entitled to this woman, she's property. You know, what she possesses is mine, her body is mine, you know, and, you know, we talk about those kind of things. And, you know, that's sort of what needs to change. I can tell you there's nothing really wholesale that's being done. I mean, certainly when people are charged and convicted with, you know, assault for domestic violence charges, you know, they're usually some sort of batterers intervention program, or anger management was always the classic sort of thing. But wholesale, growing up, it's just not there. You know, if you're lucky, you're part of a family that doesn't really support that kind of power structure within the home. But I think that that's pretty rare, or at least that's certainly how it feels given the prevalence of domestic violence within our population. So there's nothing that's being done, not really. You know, there could be more. You know, we spend a lot of time in elementary schools, you know, talking about bullying and you know, and things like that. We could talk about some of these other things too. Yeah. The problem is, you start talking about these things, and then because of the stigma, the parents of these kids swoop in and they're like, whoa, what are we talking about here? I'm okay with bullying. That's one kid being a jerk to another kid.
It's
you know,
not gonna
I'm not
happen to
okay.
us.
Yeah, I'm not okay with all of this other stuff
Yeah.
that includes gender dynamics and things like that. And some of it is because that's how they live at home, and it feels that's their norm. That's what they do. But then some of it is, you know, it can be accusatory. You know what I mean? You know, you have your 6-year-old come home from school and be like, hey, Mom, how come you don't have a job, but Dad does? You know, it starts digging into some of those kind of things at home. And, you know, people don't want to deal with that, because it might be a tradition, it might be how they choose to live. And they don't necessarily want their kids having those conversations. I mean, it happens all the time. I personally get some resistance from parents, you know, when I'm talking to these kids at shelter. We're in shelter.
Yeah.
We're already there. We're past the big
It's
thing
time
that
to
got you
break
here.
the white picket fence
Yes,
down.
and so,
Yeah.
you know, and then I'll go into high schools and talk to high school students, and, you know, and sometimes there's flack. There's usually a lot of front loading on the part of the teachers or the administration with the families of the kids who are in these classes to say, here's what we're talking about. We're very detailed. Of course, I will get, you know, because generally I'm pretty frank when I'm talking about DV and gender dynamics. But, you know, I'll get basically a rider from the teachers saying, okay, here's what I want you to miss. You know, here's what the parents have sort of expressed their concerns. And that's not a conversation. You know what I mean? That's an after-school special at best, maybe some, you know.
It's not the effective
Schoolhouse Rock version.
straight to
of TV.
it that
Yeah.
we need to be having, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about children some, and obviously the college age. The impact on children relative to domestic violence. I'm sure there's lots of research out there. One can imagine how it might affect their development and their social dynamic. You, as a children's advocate most of your career, speak to how that can negatively impact children and the stories behind that.
I have a hard time saying it negatively impacts them because, we won't know.
Okay.
Until people grow up, how they're going to turn out. But it sets them on a path.
Yeah.
It sets them on a path for, gravitating towards what is normal for them. So certainly if they are growing up with this, that type of behavior, because, we're watching this relationship happen in front of us. Okay, this is what a relationship looks like. This is how I need to operate. You're constantly fed messages about what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman, and you operate within those parameters as a child as you're growing up. Yeah. You go to school and your friends aren't quite doing those kind of things, so then there's a lot of confusion for you as far as, okay, well, what is this supposed to look like? 'Cause my house looks like this, your house looks like that. And within domestic violence, there's 4 sort of core concepts. You have a primary abuser, a primary victim, you have isolation, and the family secret. Like those are kind of our core concepts when we're defining it, and that family secret and isolation piece are really, all of it affects the children in seemingly negative ways, but those ones are really tough because those ones actually put pressure on the child to perform. A lot of the kids that I work with, out at the shelter, they weren't having sleepovers. They weren't doing some of that sort of normal stuff that we grew up with that was super important to their social construction and development. And so they grow up without that. It's one of the things that we focus on out on the shelter with the kids is I want to teach these kids how to be good friends. I want them to know how to put their trust in other people, how to be reliable themselves, and to be accountable to a group. Because, most folks, regardless of what you go through, if you've got some good, solid people to lean on, okay, then you might get through what you're going to get through, but you have to first be able to develop that crew of people that you can lean on. And so those are really important constructs that we can work with kids out at the shelter. And, it's, when I'm startled by my kids out there, because I've been working with kids in residential settings for 23 years, so I don't get startled too much, but their lack of social development. There's a lot of other stuff that we see, but their lack of social development is really the most startling. And they can talk, they can do all that kind of stuff. They can put on the front like I'm friendly and all that kind of stuff, but they really have a hard time connecting with other human beings. And we are social creatures. If we cannot do that, and these kids can feel isolated in a room full of 1,000 people, and it's because they have a hard time connecting with other folks. Some of that is a defense mechanism. You get close to somebody, then they're in a position where they can hurt you, and so, those are the kind of things that I see, and they're immediately prevalent, they're obvious, when I'm working with the kids. But those are the ones that we see a lot. Our kids out at the shelter, if you come out there on any given day, they look like they're having a ball. And that was
I've been there, and they do.
That was kind of my goal.
They do.
My goal was always, make it summer camp year round.
Yeah.
But summer camp has activities where you're working together and you're learning how to make friends and you're pulling that kind of thing together.
Sure.
If we get to DV 101, sure, that's fine. But most of our kids can't even wrap their heads around those concepts yet. So let's just get into some social development, some things we can work on in day one. And, and like I said, when you go out there, it just doesn't appear on the surface like they're having a bad time.
Yeah. And play is social development, right?
Play is social development.
Yeah.
Running around is social development. Learning how to, avoid the house witch, as we call it. It's like it's the one that's usually yelling at you, for doing stuff.
The bad cop.
And every neighborhood's got one, and you kind of learn how to navigate those kind of things. And those are life lessons that, build into the future. This is how you have to navigate the world. There's people you want to avoid, there's people you want to gravitate towards, and there's, an acceptable path to get there, right? And so, when I think of those negative impacts, the real negative impact is that we're perpetuating, and I don't even want to say this cycle, because a cycle comes back around, it looks good at some point. We're just perpetuating this straight line, and so that's the real impact. We're raising another generation of folks that are going to be getting into power-based violence relationships, and
how are we beginning to change that?
Well,
you talk a lot about gender-specific norms and how that has impacted this phenomenon, if you will. But how have we began, and what do we do now to break that cycle, if you will?
We have to speak frankly about it. We have to own up to how we've contributed to this. You know, and again, that's a hard thing to do. You think about, some of these people, say in the Me Too movement, and some of these folks that have been accused of certain things. Now, some of them are gross and egregious, and everybody would agree, oh, no, that's a sexual assault. But then you've got a few, and I'd be willing to bet that on the inside, they're like, what, that's a problem? It's because we don't have this common understanding of what is a sexual assault. We don't necessarily have a common understanding of what is domestic violence. We have to have a common understanding, and it's got to be one that's not just shared by people in the movement. It needs to be shared by everybody, and there's a spectrum of these kind of behaviors. With DV, on the intense spectrum, you've got, the physical beatings and the abuse that everybody can identify. Oh yeah, that's DV. And then you have the little kind of innocuous sort of control-y pieces. One of the things that I talk to our high schoolers about, is, when you're starting a new relationship, oftentimes, those relationships, they can look exactly the same, whether they're brand new or whether they're controlling. You always want to be with each other. You always want to talk. And of course, now we got phones, so you can always text. But when you turn that on its end and say, okay, well, how could this be controlling? Well, if I'm texting you and you're not texting me back, well, I can make you text me back, and you can be with your friends, but you're really with me because you're focused on this phone, right? You want to go out with your friends, and I'll be like, I don't think your friends like me, so I'm just going to stay home. You go out. Well, in a new relationship, no. She's going to stay with you.
Which could turn into nothing. It could be innocent, or it could be the beginning of something that is
isolation.
Rooted. The isolation, the manipulation, the fear factor, and it could really grow into something. For sure.
I think oftentimes it always presents itself. It
doesn't always come as the big monster.
No, it's not a monster. That's just it.
Yeah.
It's not the monster, because if it were a monster, then I'd be able to see it. Okay, so it's never a monster. It's always cloaked with charm.
Love and intimacy.
It's always cloaked in charm and charisma and all the things that we love. And so when we're in that relationship, and your partner says, no, I don't. Your friends don't like me, I'm not really sure, I'm going to stay home. And, I really kind of thought it would just be me and you tonight. And then you're going, oh yeah, that's right. You know what? I do want to stay home with you because I love you. And I'm really kind of mildly obsessed with you because I'm so young and I'm in love. And that's okay. That's not a bad thing. That's developmentally appropriate. Okay? So that's okay.
But when it's done time and time and time over and over and over, right?
It goes back to
30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old.
When it's done with the intent to control the other one.
There you go.
And it goes back to some of that comprehensive definition, where it's a pervasive behavior over time rooted in power and control of your person, right? It's not because you don't, like your intent, your goal is to keep your partner home so they don't go out with their friends. That's not okay. Now, here's where it's developmentally appropriate, where I was really hoping you would stay in with me. No, I'm good, I'm going out. Okay, and it's literally never a problem again, that would be appropriate. Now, if I say, no, I'm good, I'm going out with my friends, and you text me every 15 minutes, hey, what are you doing? Hey, send me a selfie. Hey, I bet you look great out there.
I'm just worried about your safety.
Tell me where you are. It's getting really late. That is you infringing and impeding upon my connections with people that are outside of you, and that is you impeding on my autonomy as a human being.
I'm trying to create some
and some people may blow this off as, oh, come on, that's just how relationships work. But this is how this kind of violence begins, right? This cannot be taken lightly. Now, if this happens from time to time because you really want them to stay home, it's different, right? But if it's that pervasive, consistent, controlling type
possessive,
behavior,
terroristic behavior.
Listen to it, pay attention to it.
And a batterer will generally meet you at your level of resistance. So if I'm trying to keep you in this box of control, as long as you're in the box, I don't have to ramp it up.
There you go.
It's when you start peeking your head out of the box, that's when we're going to get into a different kind of, say, power structure that I'm going to put in place. And again, then I have all of these sort of societal structures that reinforce my notion of entitlement, ownership, a role in the family. We start talking about roles in the family, like those kind of things. They need to change. And I don't know if there's a secret in there somewhere. if the person who has, say, more of a dominant role, right, values their partner in the same way that they value their own role,
Yeah.
then it would seem like it would be okay. But there's this difference in how I value you. Okay, I went and did a talk out at the Hope Center here in town. Had this big guy stand up, a giant, 6'8", 300 pounds, and he says, well, you know, what am I supposed to, because we're talking about like normalizing or at least bringing some, I don't want to say equality, but bringing a shared value to a relationship. And he says, well, what if my house is getting broken into? I'm getting, you know, what is it called, a home invasion, right? And I'm like, okay, well, in that scenario,
Right, in that scenario,
okay, fair enough. I'm like, you're 6'8", 300 pounds. That might be within your purview.
Yeah.
However, if you value everything your partner brings to your relationship as much as you bring your ability to defend your home against wayward home invaders, then you might not have a problem. You know what I mean? Like that, it almost seems like that classic nuclear family thing might work. You know, if the person that's the breadwinner is not the most important person in the house. You know what I mean? That there's more of a balance of power.
Uniqueness, I mean, gender uniqueness is nothing we want to discard, right?
Right.
But when you look at a balance of power in a relationship, doesn't matter male, female, what does that balance of power look like, and why is it even there, and how is it misused?
And when you're talking about, say, same-sex relationships or things like that, what you find is you find the classic things: who's stronger, who makes the most money, who's the most socially visible and adept, and those are sort of the building blocks for the power in that relationship. You know,
and if that person makes more money, or if that person's stronger or more socially engaged with their community, that's cool. But it doesn't have to be misused power, right?
We say that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, but we're bombarded with successes, making money, being stronger.
But isn't the threshold when that person misuses that power?
But I think that person is not always thinking to themselves,
Gotcha.
how can I do this?
Yeah.
I want to be able to give all this accountability over to batteries.
Because he's in the box.
Yes, but at the
Because he's in the
same
box.
time, we're programmed to behave in the way that we do. We all think that we're unique little tulips, but we're really not. The things that make us unique is, I don't know, I like this kind of music, I like to wear these kind of clothes, I get a goofy tattoo on my head. That makes me unique. But how I was cultured into being a man, okay, what a man means, and what it means to be a man in a relationship, those things are pretty consistent across the board. And so those are the kind of things that we need to create some disruption with, because those are the things that lead to that sort of almost this larger picture. Well, and it is, and that
it is. And you have to be willing to have the conversation to really get to the nucleus of it, right?
I have to be willing to stand up as a man and say, first of all, I need to listen to women.
Yeah.
Okay, I need to absorb what it is that I'm hearing from them. And I need to figure out, okay, where have I been, where have I sort of been controlling? Where have I put myself in a position where I was exhibiting this control over other people? Whether it's an intimate relationship or not, how has my upbringing sort of fed this society, this construct that we built for ourselves that puts one gender over top of the other, or in any social structure, one race over the other, one socioeconomic strata over the other. There's a lot of these social structures that are in place, and they're in place for a reason. And the people who are at the top, who are benefiting, have a really hard time letting that go. We hear about white privilege and all this, and nobody wants to even admit to it.
Yeah.
Okay, but ultimately, that's what has to change. The folks who are kind of seemingly in power have to acknowledge that that's where they are. And okay, what can I do? Well, first thing is, I'm going to stop really sharing my opinion, and let me listen to somebody who's not had that power growing up.
Yeah.
Right. So you think about that step up, step back. Right. So I'm going to step up and I'm going to use my privilege, or I'm going to use my power in this space in order to tell other folks, hey, we need to have a seat. We really need to listen. And so what happens with that is that you have folks coming forward with their powerful stories and their experiences, and that is where people get uncomfortable in the shift, but that's also where growth happens.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
also
growth
where
really doesn't happen without discomfort, right?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And so, it can be very uncomfortable to talk about this subject. I recognize that. I recognize that this subject is sensitive, that it is not always, it's not dinner conversation. Maybe at our house it is, but it's not dinner conversation. Right? It is for us because it's just who we are. But it's difficult, it's sensitive, and we need to recognize that. There's a lot of folks out there that are trying to process and trying to heal from their experiences, and so there needs to be a sensitive level to that. Also, I would also probably say that there's a lot of us that are out there processing and healing, and we're at a point within our narrative where we're willing to say to folks who are ready to be vulnerable to say, I have behaved in this way. It sounds like I behaved badly. How can I fix that, and how can I be a better ally? I feel like we're getting to a point where a lot of us, maybe not all of us, and that's okay because you're allowed to be where you're supposed to be in your journey. But there's a lot of us that are willing to say, I am ready to hear your own introspective thoughts about how you can improve and what you should do. I don't want to get inundated with that kind of stuff all day because that's exhausting. I can't fix you, right? Yeah. But also it's okay for folks to come and be uncomfortable in the shift and say, I probably have behaved in this way and that probably isn't a good idea. I'm introspectively trying to make some changes within myself to make sure that I'm always bringing this element of equity into my relationship. Yeah. And so I want to work on that. I want to get better with that. Tell me more about your experiences. What can I learn from this?
And there's great masculinity and the power of a man to be that vulnerable, right? And to be willing to acknowledge what we've done wrong and then begin to listen so we can learn and we can change our behavior.
So let me say this too, and I'll add to that. So the person whom you've harmed, and I'm not saying you because you harmed someone, but I'm saying let's just kind of go with it for the dialogue's sake. The person whom you harmed, that might not be the person that you should be having that conversation with. Okay, because that person gets to decide what kind of interaction, if any, ever at all, right? If you've harmed someone, that healing process is probably at a point where you may not get invited to that conversation. But what you can do is have conversations with perhaps maybe someone else who is ready to share their experiences and to say, this is how it feels when you do this in a relationship. This is how that feels to me.
And then learn how to be different.
But then receive my feedback to say, okay,
be vulnerable enough, be man enough to listen.
Yes, be man enough to listen, to say, I hear you saying that this is really harmful in a relationship. Why is that? Oh, well, let me help you have a deeper understanding of how that makes me feel when you victimize me or when you take away and strip me of my autonomy or my access to different resources. Let me share with you how that makes me feel. And then the hope and the goal is for a lot of folks to step back and say, I never had the intent of making you feel that way. My intent was to protect, because we like to be able to feel like we're the hero, we're the savior. But in reality, the hero and the savior often has more identifiers with perpetrator behavior than they do with actual helping behavior for a survivor. Which is an interesting theory, but we may or may not get there. I don't know.
I recently read a book called The Mask of Masculinity by Lewis Howes, and he breaks down a lot of this and how our culture has structured a man to believe that he has to behave this way and act that way. And I think there's really great vulnerability, great power in true masculinity if he is willing to have this conversation with someone that's willing to have it back with him and give him feedback. We've got a lot to learn. And this is deep, deep stuff. So we are going to close out part one because we're going to go to part two. There's so much to talk about. So I hope you guys will take time to share this podcast. We've got so much to talk about. We're going to extend it on out and make a second part to this. We'll come back and talk about why victims stay. It's a meaty discussion. Lenzi's going to really dive right in, and we'll talk about the warning signs around domestic violence, warning signs around the abusers, and how victims can get help, and how we can help family, friends, coworkers, someone that we think may be in trouble. So come back to the second part of the conversation, and we'll see you then.